Good evening. Welcome to Chasing Shadows with Ron Deibert and Ellen Nakashima. I'm Amanda Olke, Director of Adult Education here at the International Spy Museum. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Ron J. Deibert, the founder and director of the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto, will be interviewed by award-winning Washington Post national security reporter and good friend of the museum, Ellen Nakashima. They will be discussing Ron's new book, Chasing Shadows, Cyber, Espionage, Subversion, and the Global Fight for Democracy. Ron and his team of digital sleuths at the Citizen Lab have investigated dozens of covert operations, disinformation campaigns, and wide-reaching subversion throughout the whole digital ecosystem. So we'll hear a lot more about that. Enough from me. Over to Ellen and Ron.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Amanda. And thank you to the Spy Museum. And it's a pleasure to be here with my good friend Ron. And first time I'm actually meeting you in person after all these years of talking by phone and calling you up at night on weekends. Yes. I remember the first time I heard about the Citizen Lab was in a Sunday front page article in the New York Times in 2009. It was about GhostNet, the Chinese hacking and surveillance of the Dalai Lama's computer network in Tibet. Quote, a vast electronic spying operation has infiltrated computers and has stolen documents from hundreds of government and private offices around the world, including those of the Dalai Lama. Canadian researchers have concluded, the Times wrote, referring to the Citizen Lab. I remember being astounded by this. And, you know, that GhostNet report was the first to out an active cyber espionage campaign in the world, pulling back the curtain on what the Chinese government had hoped would be a covert operation. Over the next decade and a half, the Citizen Lab has increasingly shined a light on shadowy corners of the internet to discover the digital means by which authoritarian governments, and shockingly even some democratic governments, spy on dissidents and journalists and activists in order to maintain power. So, Ron, you've called this a David and Goliath story. The Citizen Lab is David. Who's Goliath? And how did you get started? What were you setting out to do?
Well, first of all, thank you, Ellen, for being here. It's a great honor to talk to you about this and to meet you in person. And I should apologize, first of all, to you. We gave that story about GhostNet to John Markoff because I didn't know you then. I might have changed my mind then if I'd known you then. Well, it is a David versus Goliath story for sure. I would say there are many Goliaths in this particular story. At the center, there is one particular mercenary spyware firm called NSO Group, which I'm sure people who are listening and watching have heard about because of their spyware Pegasus. And we were the lab that first discovered Pegasus spyware being used and abused on an individual's phone. And they are definitely a recurring antagonist throughout the story. In many ways, it's the story of the Citizen Lab versus NSO Group, and I tell the origin stories of both actually in the book. But there are other Goliaths as well. I think NSO Group is not really unique. It's part of a larger ecosystem of surveillance companies and mercenary spyware firms. There's a new one I'm sure we'll be talking about later on that we're investigating right now. And in fact, before we came across NSO Group, we were investigating other mercenary spyware firms as early as 2011, a firm called Gamma Group, and they had a product called FinSpy that we actually captured the exploit for, and another company called Hacking Team. We had numerous back and forth with Hacking Team. It's quite interesting because, as I detail in the book, their Hacking Team itself was hacked at one point, and all of their internal communications were splayed all over WikiLeaks for us to search through, including all of their discussions about Citizen Lab reports.
So I want to get to the mercenary spyware industry, but first let's talk about a little bit about the earlier origins, because for the first decade or so, your research, the lab's research, focused on the threat posed by the Chinese government primarily, right? What was distinctive about this threat its
Mhm.
tactics and tools, and how did you crack it all open?
Well, I should say, first of all, when the lab started, the
Mhm.
vision we had, and I wrote this into the proposal to the Ford Foundation in creating an interdisciplinary lab that would do this type of research, to have as its mission to do counterintelligence for civil society. At the time, that was quite audacious. We had no basis whatsoever to make that type of claim. It was all aspirational. And now that's pretty much what we do. So early on, we were doing a lot of different things in that broad umbrella, documenting government censorship of the internet worldwide. We relied on technical means to map out where information controls are happening that governments didn't want certainly their citizens to know about, maybe were actively hiding. And in the course of doing that, we were also exposing the infrastructure, including sometimes Western companies that were facilitating
Mhm.
control of information abroad. And then gradually I came to realize that malware, malicious software, could be used as a vector for espionage. And I'd heard a few people talking about suspicious things going on in that realm. It wasn't until I met a person named Greg Walton, who I hired at the Citizen Lab, that we really got active in this area. He had trusted relationships with Tibetan communities in Dharamsala, India, and they suspected their computers were being monitored. So we went up and did essentially a site visit and wiretapped their computers with their consent and observed the network traffic and captured all of the data transfers that were going on and analyzed them. And that's where we discovered the Chinese cyber espionage campaign. I guess the distinguishing feature there was the sloppiness,
Mhm.
compared to certainly what the Chinese are doing now, and also mercenary spyware companies. So back then, within the network traffic, one of our researchers, Nart Villeneuve, noticed that there were 26 characters that just kept coming up over and over again in the network traffic dumps. And he simply Googled them and came across a website that was not password protected. And on that website was a directory that the operators in China of this massive cyber espionage campaign had left not password protected. And we could simply browse all of the victims that they had meticulously organized, all the computers that they had hacked. And we began to infer, based on some of the names of those computers, who those victims were. So it was like embassies, diplomatic missions, government agencies. It was unbelievable. And we actually didn't know what to do. We'd never encountered something like this. So we infected our own device in the lab and watched as it checked in to that spreadsheet and observed for, I think, about 8 months as the hackers went about their business. We didn't even know who to disclose this to. It's bizarre to me to even say these things now, considering how thoughtful we are and rigorous we are these days about things like responsible disclosures to victims and so on. We were kind of dumbstruck, like, what do we do with this? So we wrote it up, and it was, I think it's fair to say, the first public evidence-based report outing a real-time cyber espionage operation, something that, of course, is pretty routine today.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, back then, the U.S. government, even though they were tracking such campaigns, were very loath to call them out publicly. Harvey is here in the audience. You would probably remember, you were in government at the time. They would not mention China as a cyber adversary or Russia, and instead refer to them by a sort of a euphemism, advanced persistent threat, APT, in part not to damage diplomatic relations. But things changed.
Yes.
In fact, today there was a big indictment of 10 Chinese hackers for similar activities.
Yeah.
Anyway, you write that the lab took a turn in 2011 with the advent of the Arab Spring, which led you all to zero in on what you called the opaque commercial market for surveillance technology, or the rise of the mercenary spyware industry. And it is, as you note, a much more challenging prey. But Why is it much more challenging, and why should we care? Why should the average person care?
That's a good question. Well, it is more challenging in part because these are firms that, at least in part, have a responsibility to their government clients to not do things in a sloppy way, to not expose their operations. In fact, they advertise them as such. We are untraceable. We are like a ghost. That's the way they market what they're doing. Effectively, if you want to characterize this industry, it's providing a kind of NSA off the shelf. I'm exaggerating, of course, but it's kind of that. It's signals intelligence capability, as if you could purchase this off Amazon or eBay. These companies are equipped with very trained, highly specialized engineers. A lot of them have backgrounds in state intelligence. They come from agencies like Unit 8200 in Israel. There's a story I tell in the book about how that industry emerged. Why should people care about this mercenary firms selling this stuff? Well, as it stands right now, there virtually is no regulation of this industry globally. And even though the companies claim they restrict their sales to governments to be used in very serious investigations of crime and terrorism, it doesn't take a major and political scientist to see through that and go, wait a minute, who's a criminal? Who's a terrorist? It's all in the eye of the beholder. When you're equipping the Saudi regime with these type of capabilities, they're going to use it, as we discovered, to go after human rights defenders, activists, and journalists like you. Not necessarily you personally, but your colleagues, for sure, as we write about in the book. So there has been a tsunami of abuses that we have uncovered over the last 15 years coming from this industry. And one of the things that we're trying to do through our research is expose those abuses to wake governments up to say, hey, this is a very serious problem. It's not just a human rights problem, it's a national security problem as well, because as we found out eventually, those tools were being used to go after government officials' phones as well.
So you mentioned the Saudi government and its targeting of journalists. This is a story that goes to my heart. That's very important for Washington Post journalists, because one journalist that the Saudi government targeted and in fact murdered was Jamal Khashoggi, a columnist for the Washington Post, and your lab played a role in helping expose, I guess, the role of the Saudi government. Let's kind of wind that back a little.
Yeah.
Starts with the spyware Pegasus, right? This is the actual malware that the Saudi government used to track some of these activists. You all found that on an activist's phone in August 2016, and you were the first to ever discover Pegasus. Tell us about how that happened and how that led you to learn more about NSO Group.
Yeah, actually, I was discussing earlier today investigations we had been doing into UAE, United Arab Emirates cyber espionage, back in 2015. They had set up a shop called Dark Matter that was made up principally of ex-US NSA contractors. And they were engaged in cyber espionage. And in the course of doing the cyber espionage, they were, of course, going out and purchasing exploits and using spyware of various sorts. And we had investigated and published reports about UAE cyber espionage. Our team on the technical side was and is still led by a brilliant computer sleuth named Bill Marzak. He had discovered artifacts connected to what he suspected was NSO Group's infrastructure. And we were kind of like most people who observe this industry, we thought, it's impossible. We'll never come across this Israeli company. We know they exist, but they're an Israeli company. There's no way we'll be able to discover something that this company is doing. And they were very low key then. They didn't speak to the press and so on. One day, Bill received a text message from a person named Ahmad Mansour, who is an activist in the UAE. He had received a text message on his iPhone, and the text message was describing images. If he clicked on the link, they would show him torture in Emirati prisons, something that he might be interested in. The whole idea was to trick him onto clicking on the link, which at that time would activate the spyware on his phone. He chose not to do that. Instead, he forwarded it to Bill. And Bill actually, in a laboratory setting, clicked on the link. It didn't work initially. And so what he did was appropriate an iPhone of the same model as what Ahmad had, and then did the same thing. And actually, we infected that phone, and we were able to capture all of the exploits as well as the spyware. The way that type of spyware works, you actually need the spyware doesn't change much. It's kind of like their Microsoft Word, if you will. It's the platform that the operators will use to send commands back and forth to infected devices. But to implant that spyware on a device, you need one or more exploits. These are constantly evolving. They're taking advantage of flaws in software that Apple or Google haven't yet discovered, and they can be quite pricey. So we actually captured the exploit chain and the spyware. And we did a responsible disclosure to Apple. That was August, I think it was like August 15th and August 28th, if I got the dates right. Apple pushed out an emergency security patch, and we published
2016.
2016, and that was the first report on Pegasus and NSO Group.
How did that?
And the security patch, it was a big deal for us because the security patch that Apple pushed out improved the security of billions of Apple users worldwide. For us, that was a huge impact of our research on public safety.
And how did discovering that Pegasus and the exploits on Ahmed's phone lead you to Khashoggi?
So we were hot on the trail of NSO Group at this point. We started to map out their command and control infrastructure. Once you have the spyware, you can understand a bit about how it communicates over the internet. So if I'm using Pegasus to hack your phone, that data has to get off your phone and get to the ultimate client, whoever it is. And to do that, it travels through a complicated circuit of computers across the internet. They try to hide those, but again, led by Bill Marzak, we developed ways to map that infrastructure out. And so Bill was doing this over the course of 2 years. And in 2018, I think it was in June or July, we published a report called Hide and Seek. This was a landmark report in this area because what we had done was present evidence showing Pegasus infections country by country. We could see that there were probably about 36 governments hacking phones domestically, but a large number of them doing them internationally as well. One of them was Saudi Arabia, and one of the countries within which Saudi Arabia was using Pegasus to engage in cyber espionage, we could see, was Canada. All we could tell was there's one phone in Canada that was infected with Pegasus. We had no information on who the owner was. And as I write in the book, I remember speaking to Bill about this and saying, do you think we could find this person? Like, how would we even go about doing that? And he said, yeah, we could do this. We developed a short list of people that we suspected would be of interest to the Saudi regime. We hypothesized it would be an activist. We developed a short list. I remember talking to people who know Saudi activists in Canada, and he literally flew around and went door to door. And eventually he met up with a guy named Omar Abdulaziz. Omar, at that time, was a student in Quebec, and Harvey, that's for you, inside joke. And he was a Saudi activist. He had a YouTube channel where he's mocking Mohammed bin Salman, all the sorts of things that you would get in trouble for. He had been harassed. Saudi agents had traveled to Canada to threaten him. They arrested his brothers back in Saudi Arabia. So when we met him, we explained who we were, and we searched through, with his consent, his SMS message history. And Bill found a shortened link with what he knew to be a Pegasus domain. that was proof positive that he was our needle in the haystack. There were some other details that I detail in the book about Omar's pattern of life that matched what we could see on the network infrastructure side. We published that report October 1st, 2018, about Omar. October 2nd, Jamal Khashoggi went missing and was ultimately executed in that horrible way. I had no idea Omar and Jamal even knew each other until the next day. I was still fielding like international media calls about our Omar report. And he said, "Oh my God, Jamal has gone missing."
Omar texted you.
Yeah, he said, I'm very afraid. Jamal has gone missing." I'm like, "Jamal, what's this about?" And I turn on CNN and I see everyone's looking at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. And actually, Omar sent us a picture. I remember this. I write about it in the book, and he circled the phones of Jamal's fiance, who was holding them outside of the consulate. And so he said, "You guys should check those phones." And I was like, "Yeah, we wish." Those were Jamal's phones, which I believe were turned over to Turkish intelligence.
Yeah, Jamal had gone to the consulate there to obtain permission to marry his fiance. He never left the consulate alive.
Omar and Jamal were very close friends. They had been collaborating for months over WhatsApp, assuming that it was private. They had no idea that Omar's phone was hacked until we discovered Omar and alerted him to it. So they were doing very provocative things that the Saudis were eavesdropping on.
So NSO Group, this shadowy Israeli firm that you have started to shine the light on, has denied any connection between the Saudi regime's targeting of Omar Abdulaziz and Jamal Khashoggi and the killing of Khashoggi. Shalev Julio, one of NSO Group's founders, was interviewed on 60 Minutes, right? And he said he would not talk about specific customers. So he didn't want to address the issue. What do you think? Is it possible that NSO Group would not know who their customers are targeting, would not know that the Saudi government was going after Khashoggi and Abdulaziz?
Well, they say contradictory things about that. So they claim on the one hand that they have no responsibility over how their technology is used, using that kind of gun manufacturer trope, right? We just make them, and what people do with them.
And we sell these only to governments that promise to use them for counterterrorism, child pornography, hunting, cartels.
Exactly. And they say, when we hear credible cases of abuse, we'll investigate. First of all, I should say a few things. One is, I don't believe anything that comes out of their mouths. After many years investigating that company and other companies in this space, they routinely deceive people, deceive the media. None of what they say seems to be accurate. So you have to take it all with a grain of salt. Secondly, if we, a small group of university researchers, the Davids in this story, can map out the entire infrastructure of NSO Group, surely they can. They're the ones maintaining it. Thirdly, I should say, after that story came out and made the news and they were asked questions about Saudi Arabia, afterwards, we continued to discover Saudis whose phones were hacked with Pegasus. So they must have investigated and allowed that client to continue using their technology. One of the best examples is another colleague of yours at the New York Times, Ben Hubbard, who wrote a book on MBS. And
Mohammed bin Salman.
Yeah. Yep. And so when our story about Omar came out, he looked at our report and phoned me and said, I received the exact same text message as Omar Abdulaziz did, as you guys report. So I said, well, Ben, that's an indication you were at least targeted. We don't know if your phone was hacked. At that time, at the Citizen Lab, we didn't have the same type of forensic capabilities we do now. We were looking mostly at, you can consider these artifacts of targeting, like a text message with a domain and a link. That's proof that somebody was targeted. Later, we discovered we develop more refined forensic techniques where we can actually go inside the phone and find proof positive of an infection. At that time, when Ben told us that he had received this, we didn't have those techniques. He went to NSO Group and they swore up and down that it was not true, Citizen Lab's wrong, they don't know what they're talking about, and that's how he reported it. Later on, we developed forensic capabilities and went back and looked at Ben's device and showed his phone had been hacked by the Saudis at the very time NSO Group was denying that it was possible and the Citizen Lab was wrong.
Well, I want to, in a little bit, get to the sort of policy implications, but people love stories, and you have some good ones. I want you to talk a little bit about how your work in exposing NSO Group's Pegasus and its use by repressive regimes led to you all being the target of a smear campaign. For instance, tell us.
Well, the origin story of the lab was that we aspired to be counterintelligence for civil society, and I write in the book, "Careful what you wish for," because we got good enough to the point where we became targeted ourselves. I mentioned the UAE case and dark matter. I discovered through the reporting of Chris Bing and Joel Sheckman, who interviewed people who worked for dark matter.
They were Reuters journalists.
They did a really neat deep dive onto that hacking operation out of the UAE. And they had heard that the Citizen Lab was targeted by that group. We don't know whether they were successful or not. I later spoke to one of the contractors, and she said, for sure, you and the senior group would have been mapped for intelligence purposes. I don't know what that means exactly. Most notorious case for us is the Black Cube targeting. So Black Cube is a private intelligence firm, I guess notoriously hired by Harvey Weinstein to go after people who allege sexual assault and rape against him. He hired this private intelligence firm to try to gather dirt on them to discredit them.
And where are they located? Headquartered in Israel?
They're ex-Mossad agents.
Ex-Mossad agents.
And actually, it was just a few months after the Omar Abdulaziz case, one of my staff, who's Syrian, came to see me. And he said, I had a very strange meeting just now. Somebody contacted me saying that they had an enterprise to assist Syrian refugees, and they wanted to talk to me to see if whether he could be of service. When they met at a hotel, the person started asking questions about the Citizen Lab, its funding, whether we have anti-Israeli sentiments, and he noticed he had a Samsung phone that he was positioning on the table. So that seemed suspicious to us, and we started investigating, and there was a Raphael Satter, who was another journalist at that time, was at the Associated Press. He was doing a story and was about to publish about this incident when Black Cube made the terrible tactical mistake of targeting my colleague John Scott Railton, who you know well. And if I was to say anybody out there, if you're going to choose somebody in the Citizen Lab to target in this manner, don't choose JSR. He went into an overdrive of digital sleuthing. He played the whole ruse out, organized a meeting in a Manhattan restaurant, invited Associated Press along, and we organized a sting and exposed this operation. It was kind of humorous. The New York Times, I think, had a headline, the tale of the bumbling spy. And it looks that way from the outside because he was he was asking kind of goofy questions. He had color-coded cue cards. Like there would be green cue cards for the innocuous questions, yellow for the slightly, whatever, and then red for the really, like, is the Citizen Lab paid to do this by governments or whatever? But when you're on the receiving end of something like that, it is very scary, actually. You start thinking twice about every interaction, looking over your shoulder. There are other incidents I describe in the book about other situations where...
But talk a little bit about how he got busted and what happened with Satter and with the cameras.
Well, I mean, at a moment during that Manhattan very expensive lunch, Satter and his colleague leapt out from the table and took pictures of this person and splashed his face all over the news. That's the thing about being undercover operative. Once you're exposed like that, you're out of a job. So, and also interestingly, when it was reported very widely, many other victims came forward, including people who had been entrapped by this person in completely different contexts, like litigation battles, including in Ontario, Canada, actually, where we're based.
So earlier we talked a little bit. I mentioned how sometimes it's not just the authoritarian repressive regimes that are conducting this sort of surveillance on their own citizens, but democratic governments. In April 2022, you published your Catalan Gate report, exposing one of what you say is the most audacious spying operations in scope and scale in post-Cold War Europe, in an attempt to target a large cross-section of Catalan civil society. How was and why was this the most audacious? Why so shocking? And tell us how you uncovered it.
That was a massive case for us. It was unbelievable to once we started rolling up. The way we work is usually the people where we get the information from in our investigations comes directly from victims. We're going out in the way that I described, that's a bit of an extreme case, but searching for Omar and then looking through his text messages. We did something like that in Spain. And the reason was there was some prior cases where there were Pegasus victims that had emerged in Spain who were Catalans. And we thought, I bet you there's more there. And so we, with the help of some people locally to that part of the world, we just started a snowball technique is the way that I think about. Probably the same methods you use when you're reporting. You talk to one person.
Absolutely.
And then you say, well, who would be of interest in your inner circle? And you go to that person and so forth. And eventually we discovered 65 Catalans had their phones hacked using Pegasus and other mercenary spyware, including the president of Catalonia and 3 former presidents, members of their cabinet, their lawyers as well, and friends and family members of victims. Our own researcher, Elias Campo, had been targeted with spyware. He had a U.S. SIM card, which probably protected him. When they couldn't hack his phone, they went after his mother, his father, and his sister's phone were all successfully hacked with Pegasus.
By the Spanish government?
Well, at first and in the report, if you read it, we don't actually make a strong case. We make a circumstantial case for attribution. We say, who else would likely do this? It's not going to be a third-party country that's going to be going after these. The fingers are pointing at the Spanish government. Very quickly, though, the Spanish government itself acknowledged, at least partially, the head of intelligence convened a meeting and said, it's true, we've hacked a number of Catalans, but 18 of the 65, they said. The rest, Citizen Lab, she had said in this meeting, I heard, even though it was confidential, people reported to me that she described us as a Russian plant. We were paid by the Chinese government, which was absurd. I mean, if you're going to cast shade at an organization, at least Google us. I was very offended by that.
Did the publishing of your report lead to heads rolling or anyone getting
She was fired.
Okay.
Yeah, she was fired, but not after casting aspersions at us. And ultimately, this was as we say, it was audacious, a massive domestic espionage operation targeting a cross-section of Catalan civil society. Catalans, of course, have been involved for many decades in, moving towards sovereignty and independence, something that is forbidden under the Spanish Constitution. They had organized a referendum in 2017, which was declared illegal. So this is a really interesting example, actually, of where it becomes tricky as to what constitutes legitimate use of this type of technology or not. Should a government that is in negotiations with a subnational government and civil society members who are advocating for independence, is it okay to use this tool to hack their phones? To me, it seemed crazy that this would be permitted. And I said to the Spanish media at the time, you should look at this not as a Catalan issue. It's because a lot of Spaniards who are not Catalan, I could tell, perceived things, anything to do with Catalan independence as somehow tainted, and they kind of dismissed it. My response to that was, if the government is doing that, if they're so reckless in using this very powerful technology, you can't be sure who they're not targeting. They could be going after journalists in Madrid, for all you know. And by the way, our forensic abilities at that time were pretty limited to iPhones, which are not as popular as Androids in Spain. And that's why we believe that the number 65 is a really gross underestimation of how many people were actually put under surveillance.
Did the case resonate in particular with you as being a Canadian, as Canada has its own deeply felt history of Quebec's push for sovereignty?
Yeah, it did for sure. I grew up in Canada during the, I came of age in the late 1960s, 70s when there not only was there a strong movement towards Quebec sovereignty, but you actually had a domestic terrorist group at the time, the FLQ, that was setting off bombs in Canada. So it was a very, always been contentious in Canada. And there have been discussions between the federal government and the Quebec government over, downloading political autonomy in various ways, negotiations over the Constitution. And I was thinking about all of that and reflecting on this case and thinking about, had it been discovered that the RCMP, which is our, FBI in the country, let's say, they had hacked the phones, wiretapped the phones of the sitting Quebec premier and the last 3 Quebec premiers and their cabinets and their family members and major journalists at major newspapers in Quebec, it would have been outrageous. The government would have fallen. It would have been a national scandal, I'm sure. Maybe they were wiretapping them in subtle ways, but not with this powerful capability that allows you to get inside someone's phone and see all of them, their most intimate details. So I was shocked at the hubris, like the audacity of this operation, but also shocked at the reaction to it within Spain. It was kind of dismissed as, oh, it's, the Catalans are complaining again. Oh, we're spying on them. Sorry,
It's what a contrast to some of the, U.S. domestic surveillance scandals and controversies of the last, 20 years or so. Harvey Rishikoff, again, I hate to keep talking, but you were, following those closely as well. Okay. But I wanted to get to some of the policy implications of what you're talking about. As we mentioned, NSO claims it sells its spyware only to governments that pledge to use them for good, legitimate purposes like catching terrorists. Do you feel that, do you think, well, yes, these are legitimate uses, or would you want to ban the tools outright and deprive maybe responsible law enforcement agencies of a means to catch the bad guys?
That's a really good question. So there are many people in my kind of human rights, civil society space in my community who make that argument, and I respect them for it. The argument is more or less as follows. There really can be no use of this type of highly invasive spyware that is consistent with international human rights law or privacy principles. There's no way to proportionately put somebody under surveillance using this type of technology, because once you get inside your phone, given how dependent we are on our phone and how extensive the data is that is in that phone that reveals everything about our personal life, and not only everything about our personal life, but a lot of other people's personal lives as well. It's an enormous violation of privacy. So it's something qualitatively different than a wiretap. Let's
Yeah,
say.
but should we care if it's a bad terrorist whose phone is hacked and privacy is being invaded?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there are people out there who say there's no legitimate defense for this tool. There are other methods to get at those risks, and certainly we live in the golden age of surveillance. Law enforcement intelligence agencies have access to all sorts of other tools. I believe, I look at it kind of pragmatically. I think that however much I respect that argument, I think that it is unlikely to ever happen, a ban. I come from an arms control background, and I think it's really politically risky to advocate for a ban on something, a weapon system or a technology, when there's no way to verify that parties to that treaty wouldn't violate it. And also, I believe it's unrealistic. I don't think that any government would go along with it in a way that it would matter internationally, because every government is conflicted on this matter. They all want this capacity. So that leaves me with the view that we have to regulate this space instead of moving towards a ban. We live in a dangerous world. We want law enforcement, we want intelligence agencies to be properly equipped. And if they're going to use this technology, that's my view, we need to put boundaries around it. We need to make sure there are proper checks and balances, that there are oversight mechanisms to prevent something like what happened in Spain.
Okay, we'll get to what the U.S. does, because maybe they're a good example of how you can try to do it. But what about those countries that don't have sort of the same regulatory oversight regime that we have? How do you propose regulating for those
Well,
countries?
yeah, it's a good question. You can't really expect to, persuade Mohammed bin Salman, please don't go after those activists and journalists. They're not. You don't have much to persuade them with, and they're going to do it. So it's a losing battle. But you can do many things short of that. And the best example comes from the executive order that was passed in the last administration.
The Biden administration, right?
You said the name. I was told coming here in DC, don't say that name.
Okay, in March 2023, the Biden administration issued this executive order that banned the use of commercial spyware by federal agencies, right?
Yes.
If that spyware had been used against U.S. government personnel or by foreign governments to abuse human rights.
Yeah, and I think it's a very positive restraint on this highly abusive marketplace. What it did was forbid 18 federal agencies from procuring that type of technology from firms that were involved in human rights abuses abroad or present a risk to U.S. national security.
Including NSO Group then, right?
NSO Group would definitely fall into that category. So what does that do? Well, it doesn't prevent Saudi Arabia from contracting with NSO Group, but it immediately removes a massive potential marketplace. 18 federal agencies. It's like for these firms, that's the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. It also sends a signal. There's a normative part of it. It's like a scarlet letter is attached to you as a firm. You're now considered taboo, and that's bad PR for those firms. So you're not eliminating all of the problems that we've been describing, but you're making incredible progress, coming at the edge, softening the edges of the marketplace, and hopefully introducing some responsible behavior. These are very lucrative firms, by the way, and they have investor groups, private equity funds. So the people who look at it and go, oh, there's this executive order and your valuation dropped by $1 billion after.
Is that what happened with NSO Group?
Well, after NSO Group was put on the designated entity list by the Commerce Department, they were sanctioned. It was different than the executive order. Their valuation dropped by $1 billion. So you're an investor. You're going to go, okay, how do we get on this? How were we red carded? How do we get out of the penalty box, to use a hockey analogy? You start thinking about limiting the countries that you're going to sell to. That's how you get at the Saudi Arabias of the world.
So you're pretty positive about what the last administration has done in this area, but clearly it doesn't go far enough. Do you think? How do you feel this current administration, the Trump administration, will it take the policy and push it further, strengthen it, toughen it, revoke it? What do you think? You've expressed some concern about its commitment to.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole separate conversation to have about all of the actions that have gone on in the last however many 35 days. It seems like a lifetime of just one thing after another. Parking that for a minute, because there's a whole element of that bears on this topic, just with respect to the regulations that were undertaken in the previous administration. No matter what your political views are, I think those regulations are vital for U.S. national security. And hopefully they realize that. Because when you have an unregulated market of the type we're talking about, it's not just Omar Abdulaziz's phone who's going to be hacked, or Ahmad Mansour, or a Catalan journalist. It's going to be somebody who works in the SCIF for the Senate Intelligence Committee, or maybe it's the wife of the person who's in that SCIF. It presents very serious national security risks. So regardless of whatever your political views are or changing administrations, I hope they would understand that.
You know, at the same time, in this administration, you have people like the current Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, who has been a strong critic of government surveillance. And just last week, President Trump himself said he scolded British Prime Minister Keir Starmer for his government seeking to force Apple to build a backdoor.
You sure it wasn't the way he was dressed? Maybe?
No. So maybe, they could well be a partner in your effort.
Hey, anything's possible. I think that it all depends on how they perceive what the risks are to their own national security. And that's why I think it's important to separate this out from one administration to the next.
Yeah.
Objectively, this having an unregulated commercial marketplace for very sophisticated signals intelligence tools that's marketed to not just governments, but non-state actors is, I think, something that we have to think about. This will eventually evolve towards. That's a risk to U.S. national security, regardless of who's in the administration.
Yeah, I want to open it up to questions, but first I need to ask you about another major case of spyware against activists that you're looking at right now, but this time it's in Italy.
Yes, another democratic country.
Yes, great.
And domestic espionage.
Domestic espionage. And it sounds like it could be a plot twist in the Oscar-nominated movie. It didn't win, but Conclave, as it involves a priest who's involved in migrant rescue, who has a close relationship with the Pope. Tell us what's going on here.
So the case in Italy has emerged because of actions taken by WhatsApp, actually. So Citizen Lab disclosed some information to WhatsApp, and WhatsApp's security team discovered that yet another mercenary spyware firm called Paragon had been able to exploit a problem in WhatsApp's groups that they've now fixed, and used it to infect users' phones with Paragon spyware. And WhatsApp, after they patched the problem, they notified all of these victims. And in the notification, there's a little message saying, contact Citizen Lab. So we are, as we speak, in the process of investigating these cases. Some of the people go public. As a research group, you can't control what the subjects of the research might want to do. It would be better for us if they didn't, but in Italy, 3 got very excited and went public. They feel very strongly about this. And that's where we are right now.
And was one of them the priest?
One of them is a priest, yeah. And so what it looks like is that there was abuse of yet another mercenary spyware firm's technology. We don't know who in the Italian government is using this. Right now there's all sorts of media speculation. Is it the intelligence? Is it the police?
What's the best theory here? I mean, this priest was involved in migrant rescue, so is it Is it someone in the government?
Maybe somebody who wanted to know what somebody else was saying in the confession booth.
But no, seriously.
I don't know. I mean, it's hard to know. What would the rationale be? I mean, these are ultimately, unless you know who's perpetrating, you can't really nail that down. But, we've had so many cases where why would that person be under surveillance? Why would the government target this person? A minor child here,
Yeah.
daughter here. Like, it's just crazy stuff.
Have you seen any pattern to the victims here in terms of their work?
Not that I can talk about publicly, but we will see. The main thing to point out here, though, is getting back to the vendor, Paragon. They had gone to great lengths to advertise themselves, especially here in the United States, as a responsible spyware vendor. And the reason they were doing that was to contrast themselves with NSO Group and other companies like them that were on the blacklist. And they were saying, we would not allow our technology to be abused. This is the first instance where it has been shown their technology is being abused. It's not surprising to me. If you have an unregulated marketplace, these firms, no matter what they say, they're going to be tempted to make more and more profits from government clients. And they're not likely going to be incentivized to prevent those governments from doing things they shouldn't be with it.
Well, we'll see if they get put on the entity list. Though, are they an American company?
It's hard to say for sure based on what research we've done on this. There appears to be some kind of corporate presence in the U.S. and they're Israeli by origin. A lot of these companies have, of course, many different layers within their ownership structures that make it very difficult to figure out who's actually in a position of ownership or where they're domiciled. Some of them use evasion techniques to get in jurisdictions, playing a kind of regulatory arbitrage, setting up in jurisdictions where there's maybe not as much scrutiny for what they're doing.
Okay. Last question, I promise, then I'll open it up. But the NSO Group and several others have come from Israel. They're Israeli. What is it about the Israeli culture? You mentioned Unit 8200, the NSA of Israel, that gives rise to these
That's a good question.
top-notch exploited.
I had the same question. I'm agnostic as to where these firms come from, but you couldn't help but notice there's an Israeli story here. There's an Israeli. And so I have a chapter in the book where I describe the history of the industry. And I think there are a multitude of factors. One, obviously, is you have a country that's surrounded by enemies that are bent on, its destruction for its history. And that puts a premium on intelligence gathering. And you have to have homegrown intelligence as well. And there was a decision, whether it was farsighted or not, I don't know, to invest in mathematics and computer science expertise. A lot of Russian emigres came to Israel. They set up this unit, 8200, in the early 1950s that specialized in hacking and is very good at it. But I think the most important is the entrepreneurialism that's actually encouraged. So unlike in many U.S. agencies that might be their counterparts, in Israel, you're actually encouraged to create spin-offs, to take your knowledge and actually, commercialize it. And that's why a lot of the companies that we see in this space, going back actually to the earliest days of telecommunications surveillance, tend to be Israeli companies. They certainly are in this space.
Okay. Thank you. All right, so we have a few minutes for audience questions.
Yeah, come on up to the microphone or I will ask questions from here. Please go ahead.
Ellen, Ron, thank you very much for the talk. Very interesting, really good. I'm really looking forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
Ellen, first of all, one comment. You mentioned a moment ago about the U.S. government possibly, collaborating with Ron's lab there, but don't you know that the Canadians are now our enemy, apparently?
With what?
Canadians are our enemy, so
yes,
we can't.
You'll be our 51st state.
Are they our 51st state? Yeah. No. So my question is regarding, use or evidence of use by non-state actors. So I do some scans for clients for this type of software. Haven't found anything yet, but I really worry that this is going to get out of the hands of governments. Now, that's bad enough that it's in the hands of some of these, non-democratic governments, as you said. But I really worry that this is going to escape that boundary and maybe even get into criminal, spyware as a service, that kind of thing. Have you seen any evidence that is happening, or do you worry about it? I mean, this has a parallel to arms control as well. So.
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, saying that you only sell to government clients gives you no assurance that those clients are not going to share those capabilities with non-state actors, especially when you look at the nature of some of the government clients you're talking about, which can be thoroughly corrupt. A good example is in Mexico. First of all, there were sales to so many different entities across Mexico, and Mexico has a history of corruption, especially in law enforcement, especially in the military. And we observed victims whose phones were hacked that were investigating the cartels. So either the cartels were using the spyware themselves, or the government operators were being influenced by the cartels. There are other cases of people who had access to this technology that were using it for personal reasons, like a sheik in Dubai using Pegasus to hack the phones of his wife with whom he was in a custody dispute and her lawyer. That's not a non-state actor, but it's an evidence of personal corruption. And I agree, it's only a matter of time. There's nothing hard written into the code that says only a government can unlock this and use it. It's a norm, and that norm is easily circumvented. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Hi, thank you so much. My name is Maria. I'm with the Electronic Privacy Information Center. Incredible work that you guys do. I have two questions. The first being, what would be your due diligence wish list? Like if governments were going to work on procurement, transparency, stuff like that, like what would you want to see them doing to engage in responsible use of this technology?
Mm-hmm.
And then a second question is, I've heard from some of our EU partners that Greece is expanding their authorization of use of commercial spyware to more run-of-the-mill law enforcement, like sub-intelligence agency, like law enforcement. I was wondering what you thought about this expansion of the market, particularly in the United States. Like, do we think it's likely that these companies are going to start marketing to maybe state-level law enforcement, local police officers, particularly in like Cop City, stuff like that? Just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, on the latter part, for sure. That for them is highly lucrative. You can sell to as many as 18 federal intelligence agencies, but wow, if you could unlock like hundreds of local law enforcement, you can imagine the money pouring in. And we know that some of these companies have done demonstrations to law enforcement in places like LA and so on. And by the way, in my own country, in Canada, I believe that we have a major spyware abuse problem in our country at local law enforcement levels. It's just not been discovered or reported on yet. They're very evasive about it. In terms of due diligence, I think that should be there. Honestly, to me, this boils down to proper oversight. We need somebody watching the watchers to make sure that if they're going to have this extraordinarily godlike capability to eavesdrop on people's lives, there needs to be some kind of robust oversight. And sadly, that's absent in most countries around the world, my country included. And usually in question and answer periods like this, I would actually point to the United States and say, you want a model, flawed as it may be, look at the United States with the various congressional committees and inspectors generals and all of this apparatus of oversight that you have in this country, which is now sadly, I guess, being chainsawed, I hear. So, that's a big problem for your country.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Galen Boffman, Just Future Project. So this has been fascinating today. I work in the criminal legal system reform space.
Okay.
And we have about 3.7 million people right now in this country who are on some form of community supervision.
I see.
So people convicted of a crime, living in the community, under control of the government. And at least several 100,000 of them are subjected to government electronic surveillance. So this is essentially spyware that they force you to put on your phone, your computer, all sorts of stuff. And I'm curious your perspective on this hidden in plain sight phenomenon in our criminal legal system. We have a giant problem with mass incarceration. I'm sure you've observed it from abroad. What do we do? Because they're not just surveilling the people who are convicted, they're also surveilling everyone around them, every life they touch. And I attended a National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers training at Georgetown recently, where they went into the data that they've been uncovering about the phone system. So anybody in the free world, including lawyers, who've spoken to clients, any carceral setting around the country, they're all talking to it, and they're all private companies.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what can you say? There's so many potential problems with that on so many levels. And the way I look at it is a normalization of personal data surveillance. I mean, abstracting that one case away, you don't even need to go there. Just look at day-to-day use of social media by people, where companies are essentially by design eavesdropping on virtually everything you're doing in order to sell you something. That's the world we now live in. That's the digital ecosystem. It's the business model of surveillance capitalism. Of course, it's going to bleed into things like that. And you know, I don't really know how we get out of this. It seems like a massive torrent in one direction and almost irreversible to some degree. Very depressing to be a privacy advocate in this climate for that reason. There is a distinction with the technology that I'm describing in the book and talking about, which is remote access. With the latest versions being so sophisticated, there's no need to trick a target into doing there's no victim interaction. It's known as zero click. So 1 minute your phone's fine, the next it's not, and you're none the wiser. And you're putting those capabilities in the hands of some pretty horrible, ruthless intelligence agencies worldwide. That's a very scary thing. That's a bit different than what you're describing, because it lacks that kind of, physical installation that, somebody's at least aware, hey, we're putting this on your ankle or whatever, on your phone, same sort of thing. This is like silent, remote access to your phone. And if you talk to the companies, they're saying there's literally no defense against it right now, other than maybe turning your phone on and off once in a while.
Wow. Thanks.
Hey, Ron, I'm glad you brought up the zero click. Is that right?
Yeah.
If you turn your phone off and turn it on, does it
There's a question of a challenge of persistence of infection. So it's very common for us to look in forensic logs and see an individual's phone being hacked dozens of times. And that's likely because of a problem keeping it on, and maybe somebody's turning their phone on and off. So, yeah.
Hey there, Dina Temple-Reston. I wanted to ask you, since a corollary of what you do is vulnerabilities, what we're watching now is we watch Doge going into government networks, as we watch them sort of fire a lot of people who might be experts. Are you watching this and wondering about the kinds of vulnerabilities that might be opened up as a result of what's going on?
Oh God, yeah. I mean, you're kind of answering the question as you ask it in a way. Like, it's just madness what's happening from that level.
Can
just
you
people
talk about
ferreting
that a little bit for people who might?
Well,
not
I mean,
necessarily know the
it
guts of
sounds to me like there are individuals ferreting through computer systems that contain highly sensitive information, that contain, masses of personally identifiable information. These are people that appear to not have the qualification or the security clearance to be doing that sort of thing, which is astonishing to me that this is going on. If I was an adversary, I'd be immediately going after those targets and thinking about them now as very attractive to get access to whatever it is I want access to, not to mention whatever nefarious intentions there may be, ulterior motives behind getting access to, like, Treasury Department computer systems, payment systems, and so on, by people who are notoriously corrupt involved in this. It's shocking to me. What a nightmare.
I think we'll have one last
And
question.
So-
from
Of course, it's got to be
esteemed-
Harvey Rishikoff.
You sure we can't end it now?
It's your call, Ron. It's your call.
Dan Deibert, his kid brother, which people don't know about, but because we're both originally Canadian. First of all, wonderful, wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I think the book should be a Christmas stocking stuffer, so everyone in the room should get one, because it's extremely kind of knowledgeable, and I received no rate of return from the purchases. So it's independent, wonderful questions. I'm going to end it sort of like, it's a bit sort of dreary, dystopia that you are articulating. And as you're saying, we're seeing the end, sort of the attack on privacy, both of democratic states and authoritarian states. And so what is the Deibert solution to this extraordinary phenomena that is taking place? You're revealing it, but it's sort of admiring the problem.
Yeah.
There have been some takedowns, which are wonderful.
Yeah.
But what is the sort of issues you want to advocate for to get control of this extraordinary problem?
Yeah. That's a good question. Obviously we talked a bit about the regulations that I think have shown the way. And I hope those regulations survive. The executive order, sanctions, 21 governments eventually signed on to a joint statement of principles. I think it was 21. And only the United States has done something so far. So you hope those governments start doing something. That would be, development of an international regime around this area, which is ultimately what you'd want to see. Excuse me. But in terms of like success stories, I end the book by talking about the community that's developed, investigating and doing advocacy, litigation around this topic. Sorry, I'm not getting choked up because I'm verklempt. It sounds like I just have a bug in my throat. Excuse me. That is, sorry, losing my voice. That is to me one of the most encouraging things. I really sound like I'm crying here, but I'm not. I swear.
Take another sip of water. It's fine.
Sorry. My voice is shot. Sorry.
So many books.
Yeah.
Ron, we're just going to imagine that we know what you said.
Thank you.
We want
It was a
to
lovely.
thank you so much. Ellen, thank you for your wonderful, wonderful questions. This has been very illuminating and terrifying. And if you want to be even more frightened in detail, we have the book for sale outside. And even though you've lost your voice, you're still going to be able to sign books for us, right?
I have hope that I will. Yeah. I'll
And they
sign
will
the
be
books.
for sale online for those of us who joined us remotely. I can't thank you enough for this great conversation. So thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks for coming out.